Welcome to the channel Relics of Time, where we journey into forgotten civilizations, lost kingdoms, and the darkest chapters of ancient history. Today, we begin the story of one of the most feared empires the world has ever known. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment, because your support helps decide which ancient stories we uncover next. This is not the story of a peaceful kingdom. This is not the story of a civilization remembered for mercy. This is the story of Assyria. A land of stone, iron, war, kings, and gods. A civilization that rose in the north of Mesopotamia and transformed itself into one of the most ruthless and efficient empires of the ancient world. When people think of Mesopotamia, they often think first of Sumer. Of the first cities, the first writing, the first temples. Then they think of Akkad. Of Sargon. Of the first great empire. Then Babylon, its laws, its walls, its kings. But Assyria was something different. Assyria did not simply inherit the world of Mesopotamia. It sharpened it. It hardened it. It turned it into something colder, more disciplined, more organized, and far more terrifying. It was a civilization born in a harsher landscape, where survival demanded endurance, vigilance, and strength. In the northern part of Mesopotamia, where the land was less predictable than the rich alluvial plains of the south, people learned early that stability could never be taken for granted. Unlike the southern cities, shaped by vast irrigation systems and river-fed abundance, northern Mesopotamia required a different kind of life. The land could be fertile, yes, but it was also exposed, closer to the mountains, closer to shifting trade routes, closer to migrating peoples, rival kingdoms, and military threats. And in such a world, civilizations do not remain soft for long. At the heart of early Assyria stood the city of Assur, not only a city, but a sacred center. A place named after its chief god. A place where politics, trade, religion, and identity merged into one. Assur was not originally the capital of a vast empire. It began as a city-state. A node of trade. A place of merchants, officials, temples, caravans, and scribes. Long before Assyria became a military superpower, it was deeply connected to commerce. Its merchants traveled far. They established trade colonies in Anatolia. They moved textiles, metals, tin, and luxury goods. They maintained networks that stretched across regions and linked distant cultures together. And this matters more than it may seem, because before Assyria became a master of conquest, it learned how to master movement, the movement of goods, the movement of information, the movement of people, the movement of power. Trade teaches a civilization how the world works. War teaches it how to control that world. Assyria would learn both. In its earliest phases, Assyria was not yet the unstoppable empire history remembers. It existed among stronger powers and larger traditions. For long stretches of time, it stood in the shadow of southern Mesopotamian kingdoms, of Akkadian legacy, of Babylonian prestige, and of outside rulers who at times dominated the region. But shadows can be useful, because while other powers rose and fell in spectacular bursts, Assyria endured. It watched. It adapted. It learned. This is one of the most important truths about Assyria. It was not built in a single moment of glory. It was built through patience. Generation after generation, rulers, priests, administrators, merchants, and soldiers strengthened the foundations of a state that would one day explode into imperial power. And those foundations were unlike anything the ancient world had yet seen in such a disciplined form. Assyria developed a political identity centered around order, divine kingship, military duty, and absolute loyalty to the state. Its kings were not merely rulers. They were chosen guardians of cosmic order. They ruled under the authority of the god Assur, and their victories were not presented as mere political triumphs, but as sacred necessity. This idea would become one of the most powerful engines of Assyrian expansion, because when war is not just strategy, but destiny, when conquest is not just ambition, but divine command, then empire becomes something much more dangerous. The early Assyrian state learned to combine religion with administration, and administration with force. Temples were not merely places of worship. They were centers of wealth, legitimacy, and ideology. Palaces were not merely royal residences. They were instruments of command. Scribes were not simply record keepers. They were the memory of the state. And soldiers were not only fighters. They were the visible edge of Assyria's will. This fusion of sacred power and political structure created something resilient. Something that could survive instability. Something that could recover from weakness. Something that could absorb influence from older civilizations and reshape it into its own identity. Assyria borrowed from the world around it, yes. From Sumerian traditions. From Akkadian language and royal culture. From Babylonian religion and literary heritage. But what made Assyria unique was not what it inherited. It was what it became. It took the old Mesopotamian world and transformed it into a more severe model of power. In time, the Assyrian kings would begin to expand beyond survival and beyond trade. They would begin to think in larger terms, not just of protecting Assur, not just of defending nearby territory, but of projecting strength outward. The geography of northern Mesopotamia played a major role in this transformation. Assyria stood at a crossroads, between the river valleys and the highlands, between agricultural lands and mountain peoples, between older city cultures and frontier zones of constant movement. This made the Assyrians more exposed than many southern kingdoms. But it also made them more adaptable. They could not afford complacency. They could not assume peace. They could not rely only on walls and harvests. They had to think like defenders, and eventually, they began to think like conquerors. In the ancient Near East, weakness invited attack, borders were fluid, alliances shifted, kingdoms rose and collapsed. Trade routes could enrich a city, or make it a target. Assyria understood that survival could no longer depend on reacting. It had to depend on control. Control of roads, control of resources, control of borderlands, control of tribute, control of fear. That last one is crucial, because long before Assyria became infamous for terror, it understood a brutal political truth: if your enemies fear you before battle begins, you have already won part of the war. This mindset did not appear overnight. It grew over centuries. Early Assyrian rulers gradually expanded their influence, strengthened the monarchy, and built the structures that later kings would turn into a machine of domination. Names that may seem distant to modern ears, Samsiad-ad-I, Adad-nirari, Tukulti-Ninurta, were part of the long process by which Assyria learned how to move from regional kingdom to imperial force. Some expanded militarily, some reorganized the state, some asserted control over neighboring lands. Some challenged Babylon itself, some built monuments to kingship, some brought new confidence to the throne. Not every campaign lasted. Not every conquest endured, but each phase mattered, because empires are not born only from victories. They are born from repetition, from trying again, from rebuilding, from refining methods, from learning what works, and what must be made harsher, faster, stronger. Assyria was becoming something new, and the world around it was changing too, the Bronze Age world. For all its splendor was not eternal. Ancient systems were vulnerable. Trade networks could collapse. Great powers could weaken. Old balances could shatter. And when they did, those who were best organized, most disciplined, and most relentless would rise. Assyria was preparing for exactly such a world. Its kings increasingly embraced the image of strength, not merely as rulers of a city, not merely as local warlords, but as chosen agents of divine order in a dangerous and unstable universe. The god Assur was no longer only the protector of one city. Under imperial ideology, his will expanded. With the state itself, to submit to Assyria was not just to obey a king. It was to accept the order of the cosmos as Assyria defined it. To resist was rebellion against that order. This way of thinking gave Assyrian expansion a chilling moral clarity. The enemy was not just foreign. The enemy was disorder. And disorder, in the Assyrian worldview, had to be crushed. This is where we begin to see the soul of the empire taking shape. Not yet the full terror, not yet the giant armies of the Neo-Assyrian age, not yet the massive deportations, the siege machines, the royal reliefs of flayed enemies and burning cities. But the foundations are already there. The belief that the king must expand. The belief that divine authority justifies conquest. The belief that fear can be a political weapon. The belief that the state must be centralized, disciplined, and obeyed. The belief that enemies must not merely be defeated, but broken. And once such beliefs are fully armed, history changes. That is what makes Assyria so important. It was not only another Mesopotamian kingdom. It was the civilization that transformed kingship into imperial command on an unprecedented scale. It helped redefine what an empire could be. Not merely large, not merely wealthy, but systematic, calculated, relentless. And as the centuries moved forward, Assyria would become exactly that. It would survive periods of crisis. It would recover from decline. It would reorganize itself again and again. And when the moment finally came, it would rise with such force that the ancient Near East would never look the same again. But before we reach the age of its greatest kings, before the names of Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal thunder across history, we must understand this first truth. Assyria was not built by chance. It was forged. Forged in uncertainty. Forged in pressure. Forged in borderlands. Forged in trade. Forged in memory. Forged in ambition. Forged in fear. And from that furnace emerged a state unlike any that had come before it. A kingdom that would one day turn into a machine. A machine of conquest. A machine of administration. A machine of terror. A machine of empire. And yet, in the beginning, it was still only a city by the river. A sacred place in the north. A place where merchants counted goods, priests honored the gods, and rulers dreamed of strength. No one there, in the earliest days, could have fully imagined what Assyria would become. No one could have known that from these foundations would rise armies that marched across continents, that kings from this land would humble Babylon, crush rebellions, besiege great cities, and carve their victories into stone for eternity. No one could have known that the name Assyria would one day become a warning. A warning whispered from court to court, from walls to battlefields, from desert roads to mountain passes. A name that meant discipline. A name that meant iron. A name that meant the empire was coming. And when it came, it did not ask to be welcomed. It demanded submission. In the next part, we will move deeper into the rise of Assyria's power, into the kings who transformed a northern kingdom into a force the ancient world could no longer ignore. We will see how military ambition, divine authority, and brutal efficiency began to merge into something terrifyingly effective. Because Assyria was no longer just surviving. It was preparing to rule. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Relics of Time, so you don't miss the next journey into the darkest and most fascinating empires of the ancient world. And remember, some civilizations are remembered for what they created. Others are remembered for what they made the world fear. Assyria would become both. The northern kingdom of Assyria, once a modest city-state, began to take shape under its ambitious kings. Early rulers like Ashurbanipal and Shalmaneser I laid the foundations for centralized power, organized administration, and a military structure unlike any other in Mesopotamia. These kings understood a fundamental truth: survival depended not just on wealth or territory, but on discipline, loyalty, and the ability to project power beyond the city walls. The Assyrian army was not a casual militia. It was a professional force, trained, disciplined, and relentless. Soldiers were raised to value obedience above personal gain, and campaigns were planned with meticulous precision. Logistics, engineering, and strategy became the hallmark of Assyrian warfare. Even early on, their campaigns combined speed, intelligence, and ruthlessness, a combination that would terrify enemies for centuries to come. Trade and conquest were closely linked. Assyria understood that controlling trade routes was just as vital as controlling territory. Merchants, caravans, and colonies were protected and taxed by the state, ensuring that wealth flowed into the capital and supported both the army and monumental construction projects. Every economic advantage became a weapon, every road a strategic asset point. One of the most striking aspects of early Assyrian expansion was the role of religion in legitimizing conquest. Kings ruled not only by law or might, but by the will of their chief god, Assur. This divine mandate gave campaigns a sense of inevitability. Opponents were not merely enemies, they were forces opposing divine order. Victory was framed as cosmic justice. and failure, was a warning to all who might defy the god of Assyria. It was during this period that Assyria began to integrate advanced military engineering. Siegecraft became a critical tool for subjugating fortified cities. Towers, battering rams, and coordinated infantry attacks allowed Assyrian armies to break through defenses that had once seemed impenetrable. In addition to sheer force, psychological tactics were employed. Displays of strength, public punishments, and symbolic destruction sent clear messages: resist and suffer. Obey and survive. At the same time, Assyria developed sophisticated administrative systems. Governors were appointed to oversee newly conquered territories. Tribute was collected regularly. Census and tax records were maintained meticulously. Roads and communication networks were strengthened to ensure rapid response in times of rebellion. In every sense, Assyria was transforming from a regional kingdom into a machine of governance and control. And yet, this transformation was not uniform. Not every campaign was successful, not every ruler left a lasting legacy. Assyria had periods of internal strife, succession disputes, and temporary setbacks. But each challenge served as a lesson. The empire became more resilient, more adaptable, more ruthless with each generation. Its leaders learned to balance ambition with pragmatism, vision with discipline, and fear with loyalty. The human element cannot be overlooked. Behind every conquest, every siege, every administrative reform, were individuals, kings, generals, scribes, and soldiers, whose decisions shaped the fate of empires. Assyria's strength lay not only in its institutions but in the relentless drive of its people to maintain and expand their power. Cultural identity, religious duty, and personal ambition intertwined to form a society that valued order above all else. Assyria's northern position also provided strategic advantages. The proximity to mountain passes allowed them to monitor and intercept potential threats from nomadic groups or rival kingdoms. Fertile valleys provided resources for food and materials, while forests offered timber for construction and siege engines. Geography demanded innovation, and the Assyrians responded with engineering, organization, and a capacity for long-term planning that set them apart from many contemporaries. By the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, Assyria was asserting dominance across northern Mesopotamia. Alliances, vassal states, and treaties were used alongside outright conquest. Diplomacy was a tool as vital as the sword. Envoys, tribute, and oaths were carefully managed to integrate conquered regions into the Assyrian sphere without constant bloodshed. Yet when diplomacy failed, the army was ready to enforce the king's will. Culturally, Assyria absorbed influences from Babylonia, Sumer, and beyond, adapting and integrating them into a uniquely Assyrian identity. Language, religion, art, and administration borrowed from neighbors, but the Assyrian approach was systematic, disciplined, and hierarchical. What made them formidable was not simply adoption but adaptation, turning borrowed ideas into tools of empire. By now, it becomes clear, Assyria was not merely a collection of cities or a strong army. It was a complex civilization that blended faith, administration, military might, trade, and geography into a cohesive system. Each element reinforced the other. Strength bred wealth, wealth funded armies, armies enforced order, and order ensured the continued strength of the state. The seeds of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which would later dominate the ancient Near East, were planted in this formative period. Kings were learning that absolute power required planning, persistence, and the integration of every aspect of society into a single, unified structure. They were laying the foundations for a state that could survive setbacks, absorb neighboring powers, and project authority across vast territories. Assyria's rise teaches an enduring lesson: empires are not born overnight. They are the product of centuries of adaptation, ambition, and relentless effort. They are shaped by geography, economy, belief, and human will. And in Assyria, these forces came together to form a civilization that would leave an indelible mark on history. By the time of Tiglath-Pileser, reigned circa 1114 to 1076 BC, Assyria had evolved into a kingdom with well-established cities, temples, and a professional army. Tiglath-Pileser was not only a warrior king but also a visionary leader who understood the importance of both conquest and administration. He set out to expand Assyria's influence far beyond its northern borders, demonstrating a combination of military skill and political acumen that would define the Old Assyrian period. The king's campaigns were ambitious. He moved south towards Babylonia, east into the Zagros Mountains, and west towards the Levant. Tiglath-Pileser I faced fortified cities, rival kingdoms, and the natural barriers of rivers and mountains. Yet, his military innovations, careful planning, and determination allowed him to bring many of these regions under Assyrian control, either through conquest or vassal treaties. One key factor in Assyrian success was military organization. Soldiers were trained to fight in formations, use chariots effectively, and employ archery with precision. Siege warfare techniques had advanced since the early days, including the use of battering rams, siege towers, and coordinated multi-pronged attacks. Tiglath-Pileser's armies could strike with speed and flexibility, overwhelming enemies before they had time to respond. Beyond the battlefield, Tiglath-Pileser I strengthened the administration of the kingdom. Governors were appointed to manage conquered territories, tribute systems were enforced, and royal inscriptions were created to document both achievements and decrees. These records served multiple purposes: propaganda, history, and legal precedent. Writing, in the form of cuneiform, became a critical tool for consolidating and projecting power. Trade also flourished under Tiglath-Pileser. Assyria controlled important caravan routes that connected Mesopotamia with Anatolia, the Levant, and beyond. This not only enriched the kingdom but also ensured that resources were available to supply the army, build monuments, and support the growing bureaucracy. Commerce and conquest were intertwined. Each campaign opened new routes, each treaty secured wealth and loyalty. Religion remained central to Assyrian power. Kings presented themselves as chosen by Assur, the chief deity of Assyria. Every conquest, temple renovation, and ritual emphasized divine favor. This sacred authority was both political and cultural, reinforcing obedience and loyalty among subjects while intimidating adversaries. The king was not just a mortal ruler, he was the earthly representative of a divine mandate. Tiglath-Pileser I's reign illustrates the balance of force and diplomacy. While the army enforced Assyria's will, negotiations, alliances, and vassal treaties maintained stability in newly conquered regions. Assyria's leaders understood that sustainable power required integration, not just subjugation. By combining military might with careful governance, Tiglath-Pileser set the stage for the empire's later expansion during the Neo-Assyrian period. Culture and identity also evolved. Assyria absorbed elements from neighboring civilizations, including art, architecture, literature, and law. Yet, the Assyrian approach was uniquely systematic. Borrowed ideas were adapted to strengthen the state and support imperial ambition. Monumental inscriptions, royal palaces, and temple constructions became expressions of both devotion and authority, showing the world the might of Assyria. Tiglath-Pileser I also emphasized the importance of logistics and planning. Armies required food, equipment, and coordination over long distances. Roads were maintained, supply chains organized, and communications improved. These practical measures were as important as the king's valor in battle. An efficient army, supported by strong infrastructure, allowed Assyria to maintain dominance in a region prone to upheaval. Despite his many achievements, Tiglath-Pileser faced challenges. Revolts, rival kingdoms, and the complexities of maintaining a growing empire demanded constant attention. Success was never guaranteed, and every campaign carried risks. Yet, his reign demonstrates how leadership, vision, and organization can transform a regional kingdom into a power capable of shaping the ancient Near East. The Old Assyrian period under Tiglath-Pileser I teaches us the importance of strategic vision. It was not only about winning battles, but about sustaining influence, integrating conquered lands, and securing wealth and loyalty. Assyria's strength lay in combining military prowess with political and religious authority, a combination that would define its future as a mighty empire. As the Old Assyrian period progressed, the foundations were laid for the later Neo-Assyrian Empire. Kings would learn from these campaigns, improving administration, enhancing military tactics, and extending influence across larger territories. Tiglath-Pileser I's reign marks a pivotal moment, the transition from a strong kingdom to an ambitious empire capable of shaping the destiny of the ancient world. History is built by those who dare to expand. Assyria dared, and the world took notice. Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BC, was a king of vision and relentless ambition. His reign marked a turning point. Assyria moved from a strong regional power into an empire with a reputation that inspired both awe and fear. Ashurnasirpal understood that power needed to be displayed not just in battle but through administration, architecture, and propaganda. One of his first acts as king was to relocate the capital to Kalhu, modern Nimrud. This move allowed him to consolidate power, centralize administration, and create a monumental city that symbolized Assyrian authority. Kalhu became a center of governance, trade, and religion, with grand palaces, temples, and monumental reliefs showcasing the king's achievements and divine favor. Ashurnasirpal II's military campaigns were both strategic and brutal. He expanded Assyrian influence into modern-day Syria, Anatolia, and beyond. His army used advanced siege techniques, chariots, archers, and coordinated infantry attacks to overwhelm opponents. Cities that resisted were often destroyed, and the king's inscriptions proudly recorded these conquests, emphasizing the consequences of defiance. Fear became a tool of governance. Beyond sheer force, Ashurnasirpal II used diplomacy and tribute to extend influence. Vassal states were brought under control through alliances, tribute, and formal agreements. This combination of coercion and negotiation allowed Assyria to maintain dominance without overextending its forces, a lesson future kings would continue to use. Religion played a critical role in legitimizing Ashurnasirpal II's authority. He presented himself as the chosen servant of Assur, the supreme god. Temples were built or restored in every conquered city, and religious rituals reinforced the king's divine mandate. By combining faith with power, Ashurnasirpal created an empire where obedience was not only practical but sacred. Following him, Shalmaneser III, 859 to 824 BC, continued this trajectory, expanding the empire even further. His reign is characterized by campaigns into the Levant and conflicts with Aramean states, Babylon, and Anatolia. Shalmaneser was also a master of recording history. The Black Obelisk, one of his most famous monuments, depicts vassal kings paying tribute, a visual record of Assyrian supremacy. Shalmaneser's campaigns illustrate the balance between military strategy and political control. Assyria's army was disciplined, well-supplied, and capable of rapid mobilization. Siege engines, fortified encampments, and coordinated logistics allowed the Assyrians to conquer cities that had resisted previous kingdoms. At the same time, diplomacy, tribute, and strategic marriages ensured that new territories remained loyal. Economically, these campaigns strengthened Assyria. Tribute, trade, and control over key routes enriched the kingdom and funded further military and architectural projects. Assyria became not only a center of conquest but also a hub of commerce and culture, influencing the broader Near East. Culturally, the period of Ashurnasirpal II and Shalmaneser III set standards for art, architecture, and administration that would last for centuries. Palaces were decorated with reliefs depicting battles, hunts, and religious rituals, messages of power, piety, and control. Inscriptions were carefully crafted to glorify the king while intimidating potential enemies. These monuments have survived to modern times, allowing us to glimpse the might and ideology of the Assyrian Empire. The human cost of expansion was immense. Assyrian campaigns often involved harsh treatment of prisoners, forced relocations, and destruction of cities. Yet, this ruthless efficiency ensured that Assyria could maintain stability over a vast territory. The empire's strength lay in its ability to combine fear with governance, ensuring that rebellion was rare and obedience was expected. The reigns of Ashurnasirpal II and Shalmaneser III demonstrate that empire is more than conquest. It requires vision, infrastructure, culture, and organization. Assyria's leaders perfected a system where the army, religion, administration, and culture reinforced each other. Every city, every temple, every monument was a piece of a larger machine designed to project power and maintain order. By the end of Shalmaneser III's reign, Assyria had emerged as the preeminent power in the Near East. The foundations were set for the Neo-Assyrian Empire's Golden Age, a period of unmatched military and cultural influence that would shape the region for centuries. By the mid-8th century BC, Assyria was on the brink of transformation. Tiglath-Pileser III, reigned 745 to 727 BC, initiated sweeping reforms that strengthened the army, centralized the administration, and created a model for imperial rule that would endure for centuries. His vision was to make Assyria not just a kingdom of warriors, but a highly organized state capable of projecting power over vast territories. Tiglath-Pileser reorganized the military, introducing provincial governors, standardized tribute systems, and professionalized the army. Conquest alone was no longer enough. Maintaining control over diverse regions required effective administration, communication, and infrastructure. Roads, fortresses, and supply lines were improved to ensure that armies could move quickly and respond to rebellions or foreign threats. One of his key achievements was the subjugation of Israel and Aram Damascus, extending Assyrian influence to the west. By combining military campaigns with vassal treaties, Tiglath-Pileser demonstrated that empire building was as much about political savvy as it was about conquest. His inscriptions proudly document battles, tributes, and captured cities, emphasizing both his military might and administrative skill. Following him, Sargon II, reigned 722 to 705 BC, continued to expand and consolidate the empire. Sargon's reign marked a period of unprecedented centralization and urban development. He established a new capital at Dur-Sharrukin, modern Khorsabad, a city designed to reflect Assyrian power, culture, and religious authority. Monumental palaces, fortified walls, and ceremonial avenues made Dur-Sharrukin a testament to imperial ambition. Sargon II's campaigns were strategic and far-reaching. He subdued rebellious vassals, campaigned against Babylon, and extended influence into Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant. His military was highly disciplined, using chariots, cavalry, archers, and infantry in coordinated campaigns. Siegecraft had become sophisticated, allowing Assyria to capture heavily fortified cities that previously resisted conquest. Assyria's expansion under Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II also relied on economic control. Conquered territories paid tribute, providing resources for the army, monumental construction, and administration. Trade routes linking Mesopotamia to Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt were secured, creating wealth and stability that fueled further imperial ambitions. Religion remained a pillar of Assyrian authority. Kings were seen as chosen by Assur, and temples, rituals, and divine inscriptions reinforced their legitimacy. Sargon II, like his predecessors, used religious authority to maintain control over conquered peoples, integrating them into the empire's ideological framework. These rulers also refined Assyrian governance, dividing the empire into provinces overseen by loyal officials. Local leaders were supervised by inspectors who reported directly to the king, creating a system of checks and balances that minimized rebellion. The combination of military strength, administration, and ideology made Assyria an exceptionally stable and formidable power. Culturally, this period saw the flourishing of art, architecture, and monumental inscriptions. Reliefs depicting battles, royal hunts, and divine interactions adorned palaces, reminding subjects of the king's power and piety. Inscriptions served multiple purposes. They recorded history, glorified the king, and intimidated enemies. Every building, every monument, every inscription reinforced the message: Assyria is supreme. By the end of Sargon II's reign, Assyria had achieved a level of dominance that few states in the ancient world could rival. Its combination of military innovation, administrative efficiency, and religious authority created a model for empire that would influence the Near East for centuries. Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II exemplify how vision, organization, and ruthlessness could transform a regional kingdom into a sprawling empire. Their legacies laid the foundation for later Neo-Assyrian rulers, who would continue to expand the empire and refine its systems of governance, military, and culture. Sennacherib, reigned 705 to 681 BC, is one of the most famous Assyrian kings, known for his military campaigns, monumental building projects, and administrative innovations. His reign marks the peak of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, when Assyria controlled vast territories from Mesopotamia to the Levant and beyond. One of Sennacherib's most renowned achievements was his siege of Jerusalem in 701 BC. The city, under King Hezekiah of Judah, resisted Assyrian demands for tribute. Sennacherib's campaign combined brutal military strategy with psychological warfare. According to Assyrian records, Jerusalem was encircled and its allies defeated, though the city itself was not captured. This event became famous not only in Assyrian annals but also in biblical accounts, highlighting the complex relationship between power, diplomacy, and legend. Beyond military exploits, Sennacherib was a visionary builder. He transformed Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, into a monumental city with grand palaces, extensive walls, and the famous palace without rival. The city became a center of administration, culture, and worship, showcasing Assyrian engineering, art, and urban planning at its peak. Aqueducts, canals, and gardens improved both the practical and aesthetic aspects of Nineveh, demonstrating that empire building required more than conquest. It required infrastructure and governance. Sennacherib's administration was highly organized. Provinces were monitored by officials, records were meticulously kept, and tribute systems ensured steady revenue. Assyria's bureaucracy under his rule allowed the empire to manage a vast and diverse population, maintain order, and support the military. This level of organization was unprecedented and made rebellion more difficult to sustain. Religion continued to play a central role. Sennacherib presented himself as the servant of Assur, and his building projects often included temples, shrines, and inscriptions glorifying the gods and linking divine favor to Assyrian victories. Religion, politics, and power were tightly intertwined, reinforcing both authority and loyalty. Militarily, Sennacherib perfected the Assyrian war machine. His campaigns against Babylon, Elam, the Levant, and other regions combined siege tactics, chariotry, archery, infantry coordination, and psychological warfare. Cities that resisted faced destruction or deportation of populations, while vassal states were carefully monitored and integrated. The result was a highly efficient and feared empire, capable of rapid response and long-term control. Culturally, Sennacherib's reign left a legacy of art and inscriptions that celebrated kingship, military victories, and religious devotion. Reliefs depicted campaigns, hunts, and rituals in vivid detail, showcasing both the king's power and the empire's organizational sophistication. These monuments have survived millennia, offering modern historians insight into Assyrian society, ideology. The reign of Sennacherib exemplifies the height of Neo-Assyrian power, a combination of military dominance, administrative efficiency, monumental architecture, and religious authority. Assyria was no longer just a regional power, it was the superpower of the ancient Near East, whose influence shaped neighboring civilizations for generations. Yet, Sennacherib's rule also illustrates the human cost of empire. Conquests brought wealth and security for some, but destruction, displacement, and fear for others. The balance between expansion and control was delicate, and maintaining dominance required constant vigilance, planning, and, at times, ruthless action. After Sennacherib's reign, the Neo-Assyrian Empire continued to thrive under his successors. Esarhaddon reigned 681 to 669 BC, and Ashurbanipal reigned 668 to 627 BC. Their rule represents the cultural and administrative apex of Assyria, blending military might with intellectual and artistic achievements. Esarhaddon is best known for consolidating the empire and securing succession. He faced internal rebellions and external threats, particularly from Babylon. Unlike his predecessors, Esarhaddon emphasized rebuilding and reconciliation. He reconstructed Babylon after previous conflicts, demonstrating political foresight and a desire to legitimize Assyrian rule over conquered peoples. Esarhaddon also undertook campaigns to expand Assyrian influence into Egypt, successfully asserting control over the Nile Delta. His military strategies were precise, combining intelligence, diplomacy, and force to maintain dominance without overextending the empire. Administratively, he refined provincial governance, ensuring that both loyalty and efficiency were maintained throughout Assyrian territories. Under Ashurbanipal, Assyria reached new heights in cultural and intellectual development. Ashurbanipal, educated and literate, established the famous library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, which preserved thousands of clay tablets containing literature, science, mathematics, law, and administrative records. This library has provided modern historians with invaluable insight into Mesopotamian civilization. Ashurbanipal also continued to conduct military campaigns, especially in Babylon, Elam, and the Iranian plateau. His army was disciplined and well organized, reflecting the enduring Assyrian military model perfected by earlier rulers. The combination of conquest and governance ensured that Assyria remained a dominant power in the Near East. Culturally, Ashurbanipal promoted art, architecture, and literature. Palaces were adorned with intricate reliefs depicting hunting scenes, military victories, religious rituals, and royal ceremonies. These works emphasized the king's power, wisdom, and divine favor. The arts under Ashurbanipal were not merely decorative, they were instruments of propaganda, reinforcing Assyrian ideology and authority. The library of Ashurbanipal also preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh, scientific texts, astronomical observations, and medical knowledge. This illustrates that the Neo-Assyrian Empire valued knowledge as much as conquest. Education, literacy, and scholarship were tools to strengthen the state and maintain cultural legacy. However, the empire's grandeur also foreshadowed its fragility. Maintaining vast territories required immense resources, constant military campaigns, and effective governance. Ashurbanipal's later years saw internal instability, revolts, and succession challenges, highlighting the inherent difficulty of sustaining such a sprawling empire. Despite these challenges, the reigns of Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal represent Assyria at its zenith, a civilization that combined unmatched military power with intellectual and cultural achievements, leaving an enduring mark on the history of the ancient Near East. Following the reign of Ashurbanipal, the Neo-Assyrian Empire entered a period of political instability and internal strife. Although the empire had reached unparalleled heights in military power, administration, and culture, its vast size became increasingly difficult to govern. Provincial governors grew more independent, succession disputes arose, and the central authority weakened. The empire faced rebellions across Babylon, the Levant, and Anatolia. Vassal states, once carefully controlled through tribute and diplomacy, began to resist Assyrian dominance. The combination of internal power struggles and external pressures created a perfect storm that gradually eroded Assyrian control. In addition to political challenges, the economic burden of maintaining such a large empire placed enormous strain on resources. Constant warfare, tribute collection, and the upkeep of garrisons drained wealth, while rebellion and unrest disrupted trade and agriculture. This made the empire more vulnerable to both internal collapse and external invasions. The rise of new powers sealed Assyria's fate. The Medes and Babylonians, formerly vassals of the empire, united against Assyria. In 612 BC, after years of coordinated campaigns, they captured and sacked Nineveh, the once magnificent capital. The city's walls, palaces, and temples were destroyed, and the Assyrian royal line was effectively ended. This catastrophic fall was the culmination of decades of overextension, civil war, and revolts. Despite the empire's unmatched military and administrative innovations, no power can endure indefinitely when faced with sustained internal and external pressures. However, the legacy of Assyria survived long after the empire itself vanished. The administrative systems, military techniques, monumental architecture, and cuneiform writing influenced successive empires, including the Babylonians and Persians. Assyrian culture, art, and literature continued to inspire, preserved in libraries, inscriptions, and the collective memory of the Near East. Assyria's fall is a reminder that even the most formidable empires are subject to the cycles of history: rise, expansion, peak, and eventual decline. Yet, the civilization left behind lessons in governance, military organization, urban planning, and cultural achievement that resonate to this day. Despite its collapse, the Neo-Assyrian Empire remains a symbol of human ambition, ingenuity, and the complex interplay between power, culture, and knowledge. The stories of its kings, warriors, and cities continue to captivate historians and enthusiasts alike, offering a window into a civilization that shaped the ancient world. Although the Neo-Assyrian Empire fell in 612 BCE with the destruction of Nineveh, the civilization of Assyria did not simply disappear. Its armies were defeated, its palaces burned, and its political structure shattered, but the systems, ideas, and methods it created survived. In many ways, Assyria outlived its own empire, because the powers that came after it inherited much of what it had built. The Assyrians were among the first to demonstrate that an empire could be ruled not only through conquest, but through organization. Their system of provinces, governors, tribute collection, road networks, royal communication, and military logistics became a model for later states. The Babylonians, who rose after Assyria's fall, adopted and adapted many of these administrative practices. The Persian Empire, which would later stretch across an even greater territory, refined similar systems of governance, communication, and regional control. In this sense, Assyria was not merely a conqueror of lands. It was a laboratory of empire. It showed the ancient world how to build centralized authority over many peoples, languages, and regions. It revealed both the power and the danger of imperial administration. The same mechanisms that created strength, centralization, taxation, military oversight, and deportation, could also create resentment, resistance, and collapse. One of Assyria's most important legacies was its military innovation. The Neo-Assyrian army was one of the most disciplined and organized fighting forces the ancient world had ever seen. It used permanent troops, specialized units, siege engines, cavalry, archers, engineers, and advanced logistics. This was not a temporary militia assembled only when war came. It was a professional machine of conquest. Later empires learned from this model. The idea that a state could maintain a standing military force, supported by taxation and infrastructure, became a cornerstone of imperial power. Assyria demonstrated that roads, supply chains, and communication were just as important as swords and spears. It was not enough to win battles. An empire had to move men, grain, metal, and orders across enormous distances. Assyria also left behind a powerful legacy in art and architecture. The palaces of kings like Ashurnasirpal II, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal were not only royal residences, they were visual statements of domination. Their walls were covered with carved reliefs showing battles, lion hunts, sieges, rituals, and the king in communion with the gods. These reliefs were carefully designed political messages. They told every visitor, every ambassador, every official, and every defeated enemy the same story: Assyria is powerful, Assyria is chosen by the gods, and resistance is futile. These artistic traditions influenced the visual language of kingship in later civilizations. Monumental imagery, symbolic processions, guardian figures, and royal inscriptions all became recurring tools of power across the ancient Near East. Even after Assyria's cities fell, the concept of architecture as political theater remained. Palaces and temples would continue to serve not only as buildings, but as declarations of legitimacy and authority. Another extraordinary legacy of Assyria lies in the preservation of knowledge. Under Ashurbanipal, the Library of Nineveh became one of the most important intellectual centers of the ancient world. Thousands of clay tablets were collected and stored, preserving myths, epics, omens, legal texts, scholarly commentaries, lexical lists, rituals, astronomical observations, and medical writings. Without this effort, much of Mesopotamian civilization might have been lost forever. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving literary works in human history, is known to us largely because copies were preserved in the library of Ashurbanipal. In the same way, many texts about religion, science, divination, kingship, and daily administration survived because the Assyrians valued written records and systematic collection. This is one of the great paradoxes of Assyria. It is remembered as a civilization of war, conquest, and fear, and rightly so, because its armies could be ruthless. But it was also a civilization of memory. It collected the voices of earlier ages and preserved them. In doing so, It became a bridge between lost worlds and future generations. The empire that burned cities also saved stories. The kings who destroyed kingdoms also protected tablets that would outlast them all. Assyria's influence on writing and record-keeping cannot be overstated. The Assyrians inherited the cuneiform tradition from Sumer and Akkad, but they expanded the bureaucratic use of writing on a massive scale. Royal decrees, tribute lists, military dispatches, omen texts, diplomatic correspondence, tax records, and architectural inscriptions all reveal a civilization obsessed with control through documentation. This habit of recording became a tool of power. To write was to define, classify, command, and remember. The state could count its resources, track its enemies, preserve its victories, and project its identity through text. This bureaucratic culture helped create a more stable and more complex imperial system. It also gave historians one of the richest documentary archives in the ancient world. Assyria's religious worldview also echoed far beyond its own time. The close union between divine authority and royal power shaped how kingship was imagined across Mesopotamia. The king was not merely a political leader, he was the chosen servant of the gods, responsible for maintaining order in the human world. Victory in war, abundance in harvest, and stability in society were all interpreted through this sacred framework. Later rulers in Babylon, Persia, and elsewhere would continue to present themselves as divinely sanctioned rulers, often using similar formulas of legitimacy. Assyria helped strengthen the idea that empire required not only armies and taxes, but also a sacred narrative that justified domination. A king needed more than force, he needed a cosmic role. And yet, Assyria's legacy is not only one of innovation. It is also one of warning. The empire became so effective at expansion that it eventually overextended itself. It mastered conquest so thoroughly that it created a system dependent on constant pressure, constant tribute, and constant military presence. Such a system could be powerful, but it was fragile. When the center weakened, the edges broke away. When succession faltered, rivals rose. When enemies united, even Nineveh could fall. This is why Assyria remains so compelling. It represents both the brilliance and the danger of centralized imperial power. It shows how far human beings can push organization, strategy, and statecraft. But it also shows the cost, fear, displacement, destruction, and the burden of ruling too much, too fast, for too long. For modern audiences, Assyria is often seen through two lenses. One lens sees the empire as a brutal war machine, famous for sieges, deportations, and terrifying royal inscriptions. The other sees it as a sophisticated civilization of scholars, engineers, administrators, artists, and archivists. Both are true. And the real Assyria lies in the tension between them. It was an empire of iron and clay. Iron in its armies, weapons, and will to dominate. Clay in its tablets, its records, its stories, and its fragile human memory. One crushed enemies. The other preserved civilization. Together, they created one of the most complex and unforgettable states of the ancient world. Even today, the ruins of Nineveh, Nimrud, Khorsabad, and Assyria speak across millennia. Their broken walls, shattered Lamasa statues, carved reliefs, and buried tablets remind us that history does not vanish when empires fall. It changes form. Stone becomes dust, but ideas endure. Palaces burn, but stories survive. Kingdoms die, but memory remains. That is the final triumph of Assyria. Not that it conquered so much land. Not that it terrified so many enemies. But that, even after its destruction, it continued to shape the civilizations that followed and to speak to the generations that came long after its kings were gone. Assyria's empire ended. But Assyria's legacy did not. It lives in the very concept of empire, in the preservation of ancient literature, in the history of military organization, in the development of state bureaucracy, and in the cultural memory of Mesopotamia. It remains one of the clearest examples in history of how a civilization can be both destructive and creative, feared and admired, brutal and brilliant. And perhaps that is why Assyria still fascinates us. Because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that some of humanity's greatest achievements are often born alongside its greatest violence. When we look back at Assyria, we do not see a single moment. We see a long arc stretching across centuries. We see a people who began in the shadow of older civilizations, living among the great traditions of Mesopotamia, and who slowly transformed themselves into something greater, harsher, and more enduring than almost anyone around them could have imagined. Assyria did not begin as the master of the Near East. It began as a city. A sacred place on the banks of the Tigris. A trading center. A religious heartland. A small state among many others, surrounded by rivals, shaped by uncertainty, and forced to survive in a world where strength was never permanent. And yet, from these modest beginnings, Assyria learned the lesson that would define its destiny. To survive, it had to adapt. To endure, it had to organize. To dominate, it had to become more than a kingdom. That transformation did not happen overnight. It was built through generations of rulers, soldiers, priests, administrators, craftsmen, and scribes. It was forged in war, but also in discipline. It was shaped not only by ambition, but by structure. The Assyrians understood something that many earlier powers had only begun to grasp. Power is not just force. Power is administration. Power is logistics. Power is roads, supply lines, archives, communication, taxation, labor, and memory. Power is the ability to move armies quickly, to gather tribute efficiently, to punish rebellion decisively, and to record every victory so that it becomes part of a permanent political message. This is why Assyria became so formidable. It did not simply conquer. It systematized conquest. Its kings did not just lead armies into battle. They built provinces. They appointed governors. They created networks of control that stretched across deserts, mountains, and river valleys. They turned distant lands into sources of wealth and manpower. They transformed local resistance into imperial administration. In many ways, Assyria was one of the earliest true machines of empire. Its armies were among the most disciplined the ancient world had ever seen. They were not loose tribal levies gathered in times of crisis. They were increasingly organized forces, trained and equipped for repeated campaigns. They included infantry, cavalry, chariots, archers, engineers, and siege specialists. They crossed great distances, besieged fortified cities, and brought entire regions under Assyrian rule. And with every campaign, the message spread farther: Assyria is coming. Assyria does not stop. Assyria does not forget. The fear that surrounded Assyria was not accidental. It was cultivated. It was deliberate. Its kings recorded punishments, destructions, deportations, and victories in chilling detail because terror itself became a weapon. To resist Assyria was to risk annihilation. To submit was to survive, pay tribute, and remain under the shadow of imperial power. This brutality is one of the reasons Assyria is remembered so vividly. It was not merely strong. It was overwhelming. It understood psychological warfare long before the term existed. It used spectacle, reputation, and public memory as instruments of rule. And yet, to reduce Assyria only to violence would be to misunderstand it. Because Assyria was not just an empire of war. It was also an empire of construction. It built capitals that astonished the ancient world. Cities like Kalhu, Dur-Sharrukin, and above all Nineveh were not just administrative centers. They were monumental declarations of power. Their palaces rose behind massive walls. Their gates were guarded by colossal lamassu, winged bulls with human heads, symbols of divine protection and royal authority. Their halls were lined with carved reliefs showing kings hunting lions, besieging cities, receiving tribute, and standing in the presence of gods. These images were more than decoration. They were propaganda in stone. They told everyone who entered, "This is a civilization chosen to rule," and behind those walls something extraordinary was happening. Because while Assyria conquered kingdoms, it also preserved knowledge. The reign of Ashurbanipal gave the world one of the most important intellectual legacies of the ancient Near East, the Library of Nineveh. Thousands of clay tablets were collected there. Myths, prayers, omen texts, legal documents, lexical lists, astronomical observations, medical writings, scholarly commentaries, and literary masterpieces were stored in ordered collections. Without this effort, much of Mesopotamian civilization would have been lost. The voices of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria itself might have vanished beneath the dust of ruined cities. Instead, they survived. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving literary works, was preserved because people in the Assyrian world cared enough to copy it, collect it, and protect it. Ancient science survived because scribes inscribed it. Religious traditions survived because priests archived them. Administrative systems survived because bureaucrats recorded them. This is one of history's great ironies. The empire that terrified the ancient world also helped preserve its memory. The empire that destroyed cities also saved stories. The kings who marched armies across continents also protected tablets that would outlive their palaces. That is why Assyria remains so compelling. It forces us to confront contradiction. It was ruthless, but sophisticated. It was violent, but intellectually ambitious. It was destructive, but preservative. It ruled through fear, yet it also built systems of order so advanced that later empires would learn from them. The Babylonians inherited much from Assyria. The Persians would later refine systems of provincial rule, roads, communication, and imperial administration in ways that echo Assyrian practice. The concept of a centralized state ruling many peoples through governors, tribute, military presence, and ideological legitimacy did not begin and end with Assyria. But Assyria was one of the clearest early examples of how powerful such a model could become. And still, for all its strength, Assyria fell. This, too, is part of its lesson. No empire is invincible. No's system, however efficient, can escape the pressures of time forever. The very mechanisms that made Assyria powerful also made it vulnerable. It expanded relentlessly. It relied on constant military pressure. It demanded tribute from distant lands. It ruled through fear and obedience. But such a structure required enormous energy to maintain. As long as the center was strong, the empire endured. As long as the king was capable, the army loyal, and the provinces obedient, Assyria remained supreme. But when succession weakened, when internal rivalries deepened, when rebellions multiplied, when resources were strained, when enemies began to cooperate instead of submitting, the system cracked. After the death of Ashurbanipal, the empire entered a dangerous spiral. Provincial cohesion weakened, revolts intensified. The Babylonians rose again. The Medes pressed from the east. Former subjects became enemies. Former vassals became avengers. And then came 612 BC, the fall of Nineveh. One of the greatest cities in the ancient world, once filled with palaces, temples, archives, walls, processions, and royal grandeur, was besieged and destroyed. Its defenses failed. Its dynasty collapsed. Its empire shattered. The city that had once seemed eternal became a ruin. This moment is more than a military event. It is one of history's most powerful symbols. Because Nineveh's fall reminds us that even the mightiest civilizations can vanish. The walls fall. The palaces burn. The kings die. The armies scatter. The empire becomes memory. And yet, memory is not nothing. In some ways, it is everything. Because Assyria did not truly disappear when Nineveh fell. Its political structure ended, yes. Its armies were broken, yes. Its capitals were ruined, yes. But its ideas survived. Its methods survived. Its administrative habits survived. Its artistic language survived. Its texts survived. Its stories survived. And that is why we still speak of Assyria today. Not simply because it conquered. Not simply because it frightened the world. But because it left behind something deeper than territory. It left behind evidence. It left behind memory. It left behind lessons. Assyria teaches us that civilization is rarely simple. The same state can create beauty and horror. The same empire can preserve literature and destroy cities. The same king can build libraries and wage brutal campaigns. History is not made of pure heroes and pure villains. It is made of systems, ambitions, contradictions, and consequences. That is why ancient Assyria still feels strangely modern. Because it asks questions we still live with. How far can power expand before it collapses under its own weight? Can order built on fear ever truly last? Is empire defined by what it conquers, or by what it leaves behind? Can a civilization be both admired and condemned? Can greatness exist without cruelty? Can memory redeem destruction? These are not only Assyrian questions. They are human questions. And perhaps that is why, thousands of years later, we still return to the ruins of Assur, Nimrud, Khorsabad, and Nineveh. We look at shattered reliefs, broken statues, burned layers of earth, and weathered inscriptions not because they are dead things, but because they still speak. They speak of kings who believed they ruled by divine right. They speak of soldiers who marched across continents. They speak of scribes who pressed reeds into clay so that words could outlive flesh. They speak of a civilization that rose from the margins of Mesopotamia and became the terror of the ancient world. And they speak of a truth that every empire eventually learns: nothing built by power alone can last forever. But what is written, remembered, and passed on, that can survive the fire. So when we remember Assyria, we should remember it in full. Remember the armies. Remember the sieges. Remember the kings. Remember the palaces. Remember the deportations. Remember the inscriptions of triumph. Remember the lion hunts carved in stone. Remember the lamassu at the gates. Remember the roads, the governors, the tribute, the bureaucracy, the discipline. But also remember the tablets. Remember the scribes. Remember the library. Remember the stories copied in silence while armies thundered beyond the walls. Remember the ancient voices that survived because someone believed they were worth preserving. That is the true legacy of Assyria. Not just an empire of conquest, but an empire of power and memory. And perhaps, in the end, memory is stronger, because the kings are gone, the banners are gone, the palaces are broken, the empire has turned to dust, but the story remains. And as long as the story remains, Assyria is not entirely lost. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the rise, glory, and fall of Assyria, one of the most extraordinary civilizations in all of ancient history. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Tell me, which Assyrian king or moment fascinated you the most? Was it Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Ashurbanipal, or the dramatic fall of Nineveh? And if you want to continue exploring the forgotten empires of the ancient world, stay with Relics of Time, because the next story is already waiting in the dust of history. Until next time, history remembers what stone cannot protect.